Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tracy Vo from Channel 9 News. It's my pleasure to be your MC this morning, and on behalf of Curtin University and Bankwest, I'd like to welcome you all for the launch of the Gender Equity Insights 2021, Making It a Priority. It is the sixth report in the Gender Equity Insights series by the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to our special guest speaker today, the Honourable Simone McGurk, a Minister for Child Protection, Women's Interests, Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence Community Service as well. So welcome, Minister. A warm welcome as well to our esteemed panel, Libby Lyons, the Director, Workplace Gender Equality Agency, Graham Kerr, Chief Executive Officer, South 32. A welcome also to the senior leaders from the Bankwest and Curtin University across the WA business community. It's also fantastic to see some students here. I was saying to the Bankwest economics people this morning, it's great to see a few tables over there, girls. So nice to see you here as well. So we'll be hearing from them as well. So that's from Kent Street Senior High School, Belmont City College and Methodist Ladies College. So it's great to see some young minds in here. Before we commence, I'd like to run through just some housekeeping issues here this morning. In the unlikely case of an emergency, the venue has a two-tone alarm system. The first warning tone will be a beep beep sound. Upon hearing this tone, please identify the closest fire exit and prepare to evacuate. The second warning tone is a whoop whoop sound. I was going to be the MC. I didn't think I was going to be a sound effects person this morning either. But if you hear this cue, this is the cue to evacuate. So leave all of your personal belongings behind, make your way swiftly and orderly to the nearest fire exit and follow the instructions of the venue staff. They'll help you out of the building. Also, but if you can, just identify your nearest fire exits as well, noting that some of them might be behind you. So also mobile phones, if they could be turned onto silent, that would be wonderful. All right, today's event, we are launching the sixth report, as I mentioned earlier, in the Centre's Gender Equity Insights series, Gender Equity Insights 2021, Making It a Priority. Since its inception, this research series has added significant findings to the national and international evidence base around what works to deliver greater gender equality across some of Australia's biggest workplaces, through expert analysis, research based on the world-leading WGEA reporting data. And this new report uncovers some fresh insights, identifying the top performers, and some of them might surprise you this morning as well, in gender equality policies, practices over the years, also what this consistency can achieve. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly this week, about quotas and targets, and today we find out if they actually work. We can also learn when we can see or expect to see the gender pay gap close, which for some occupations isn't looking too optimistic, unfortunately. John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Associate Professor Rebecca Cassells, Deputy Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, will take you through the report a little later. After the findings as well, I'll be asking our knowledgeable panel what their reactions to these findings are, what we can create as well to have a more gender equitable workplace. There'll also be time for questions from you, so have a listen to the report and see what piques your interest. If you have any, you can send them through to the Slido app technology. I'm trying to work that out as well, but hopefully I don't stuff that up this morning. But if you go to www.slido and enter the event code #GenderEquality, that'll be displayed on the screen. You can log on, type in your question, but you can also vote for other people's questions as well. If they've got something that, again, piques your interest, you can vote that. So make your questions a good one. If you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet during the presentation. The hashtag is Gender Equality. The handles are at Bankwest Curtin, at WGEA or WGEA Agency. And please also, as I said, make sure your phones are on silent though. All right, I'd like to now invite Whadjuk Noongar Elder Sandra Harbin to the stage to deliver today's Welcome to Country.
So kaya Mridich Marman and Kwabadak Yogas. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Kaya. Thank you. Always like to get a hello back. So yes, my name's Sandra Harbin and I'm a Wajak Nyunga, and I'm really happy to be here representing the traditional owners, the Wajak Nyunga people, of whose land we all share today. I'd first of all like to acknowledge all of my Noongar elders, past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal elders from all over Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. You know, one of the things that I like to share when I do a Welcome to Country is just, you know, a fact that Australia's Aboriginal cultures are the oldest and continuous living cultures in the world. And I think that's something that we as all Australians should be really proud of, and just pause for a moment and to think that we are the oldest continuous living cultures in the world, and that the Noongar Nation are the largest cultural bloc in Australia, which means that there's a lot of us Noongars. So just putting it out there. And, you know, when we think of, you know, time, in our language, in our Noongar language, we just have one word, and that's nyiting, which means since the beginning of time. So if you can tell me how long ago that was, I'll be really, really pleased to have that bit of knowledge. So, yeah, so we've been here since the knitting. And I also like to put it in perspective, and I think of, you know, the pyramids. They've been here 3,000 or 4,000 years. That's a long time, but we've been here far longer than that. So again, just like to share that with you, because it's also, you know, doing a Welcome to Country is a wonderful opportunity, you know, to showcase our culture and to share with you our language and some of our stories. And it's also something I'm really proud of, like as a woman, to be here to deliver the Welcome to Country, because one of the things that many of us Noongar women have observed for a long time is that a lot of the Noongar men get invited to do the Welcome to Country. So I want all of you to acknowledge that us women, us Noongar women, have a place in conducting these really important ceremonies. Welcome to Country. And just listening to our MC telling us about OC health and safety, I just wanted to let you know that a Welcome to Country is about keeping you all safe while you're here on Noongar Budja. And it is about OC health and safety. So I'm going to make sure that when I do my welcome, we're going to ask for the beautiful spirits to come in to keep you all safe while you're sitting here on Noongar country. So, before I do that, I would now like to acknowledge all the Bridias. Now, in our language, the Bridias are the bosses. And as I was sitting here looking at how many Bridias there are, how many bosses, there was quite a lot in this book. So I can't remember all of their names, but when I acknowledge the Bridias, if you look at your first 2 pages, you'll know who I'm talking about. So, to the Bridias, the bosses that are here, that are helping make this event a success, I'd like to make a special acknowledgement to you all, particularly the Minister, Simone McGurk, who I've known for, or been acquainted with for a number of years. A very, very special acknowledgement to the Minister, and also to and I will just also acknowledge Libby Lyons, also a special acknowledgement, because she's obviously a yoga out there that does wonderful work in terms of the event here, the gender equity. So a very special acknowledgement to you all. So Kaya and Wanju Wajak Nyunga Budja, you know, Ngan Court is Jurapan to be Wangani with Nunakurt is Ninin there. Ninin Kura, Yay, and Brudawan. Nunok can have a Nganin and some Merin and some Dutch and some Kep. kora nganya mort kurkuling on the buja, and they ninin, and they ne, and they karajan kora, and yay, and Burdawan. What I said was, hello and welcome to Wajak Nyunga lands. We're all sitting here, we're all joined here this morning to celebrate this event, and we're going to have some beautiful food and some nice cool water and so on to make this really enjoyable. A long time ago, my family, my ancestors, so my mort, they sat and they listened and they shared knowledge, because today we are going to continue what Noongar people have always done, and that is to sit, listen and learn today about gender equity here in 2021. And I think that's something that we're all really, really looking forward to. I want you all to join in with me, because I don't think I should do all the talking. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to, after me, and it's going to be really lovely for me to hear you speak in the first language of this land, the Noongar language. So I'm going to ask you to, with me, to call on the beautiful spirits to come here and be with us. So, Yarl Kul Kwabara Wirin. Yarl Kul Kwabara Wirin. So we've asked for the beautiful spirits to come here. Yarl Kul means for Yarl is to come here, and Kul is to move along. So if you haven't spoken Noongar before, which I know for a fact you all have, but at least I heard you all speak in Noongar language. So Yarl Kul Kwabara Wirin. And so we will also then tell the negative spirits to leave, because we just want all good energy here with us to keep us safe today. So we're going to say Wurt Kul Wara Wirin. Right, so Wurt Kul Wara Wirin. So we've asked for the negative energies to leave and for the beautiful spirits to join here with us. So on behalf of the Wajak Noongar people, Wanju, welcome, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to showcase our language, the first language of this land, and to conduct the Welcome to Country on behalf of the Wajak Noongar people. So kaya, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, as well, and keeping the room safe for us here this morning too. I'd like to now welcome the Chief Information Officer at Bankwest, Rebecca Mitchell, to welcome and introduce the Honourable Simone McGurk.
Thanks, Tracy. Following that incredible welcome to country, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wujak people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In the spirit of reconciliation, I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Honourable Simone McGurk, MLA, Minister for Child Protection, Women's Interests, Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence and Community Services, who will be speaking today. And I also acknowledge Gail McGowan, Director General, Department of Mines, Industry, Regulation and Safety, and Michelle Andrews, Director General, Department of Communities, who are all speaking today and attending. I'm Rebecca Mitchell, Chief Information Officer at Bankwest, and it's a pleasure to be here today representing Bankwest. Now in its 8th year, our partnership with Curtin University to support the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre forms an integral part of our ongoing support for the well-being of our customers, businesses and communities in WA. The social and economic research produced by the Centre is helping inform and shape debate and public policy on critical issues impacting both our great state and our nation. I'd like to welcome everyone to this report launch today, the sixth in the series between the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Over the past 6 years, the Gender Equity Insights report has grown in prestige and is a leading source of gender diversity analysis and discussion, not only in WA but across Australia. On behalf of everyone, I would like to thank WGEA's outgoing director, Libby Lyons, for her passion and dedication to gender equality during your time at WGEA. Libby, your leadership and the work of WGEA have really helped shift the dial on gender equality and make this an issue that can simply no longer be ignored. After 13 years at Bankwest, I recently took on the role of Chief Information Officer. It's the first time a female has held this role, which leads one of the largest technology teams in WA. And the significance of this is not lost on me. It's important for women and girls to see senior female leaders and realise that they have just as much potential as anybody else, and particularly in tech roles as well. But I do look forward to a time, hopefully in the not too distant future, where female firsts become insignificant. Because for me, diversity as a whole is really important, and it's vital that our workplaces are well balanced in terms of diversity. For us at Bankwest, this means the diversity of our 3,000 strong, mostly WA-based workforce needs to reflect that of our 1.1 million customers that we serve nationally. Because this diversity allows us to better understand how we can support and improve the financial well-being of our customers and communities, which is an exciting prospect for the future, and a bit like the excitement I hold for technology. It's a frontier of continual change, growth and opportunity. Thank you also to Professor Alan Duncan and Associate Professor Rebecca Cassells from the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre for your work on this report. We very much look forward to hearing from you shortly and the discussion that will follow. I'd now like to introduce the Honourable Simone McGurk, MLA. Minister McGurk is the member for Fremantle and Minister for Child Protection, Women's Interests, Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence and Community Services. She was elected to Parliament in 2013 as the member for Fremantle and appointed to this current portfolio in 2017. Minister McGurk is WA's first Minister for Family and Domestic Violence and has been instrumental in developing a whole-of-community approach to tackling this growing issue. This includes the development of a 10-year strategy to reduce family and domestic violence, including much-needed reforms to WA's family violence laws, WA's first one-stop domestic violence hubs in regional WA, and the successful annual 16 Days in WA Stop Violence Against Women campaign, of which Bankwest is a proud supporter. Minister McGurk is also focused on improving outcomes for women and girls in WA, including addressing gender inequality through the state government's Women's Report Card and through her strong commitment to supporting events such as today's. Please make her feel welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Rebecca, for that introduction, and also to Sandra for that beautiful welcome to country. I won't talk for too long, but I've met Sandra a number of times, including the two granddaughters that she cares for, has helped raise, and I've met those granddaughters when they were young, and I just heard that one of those granddaughters is enrolled in pre-medicine at UWA. So you're doing a pretty good job, Sandra, can I say? Fantastic. Can I also acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay my very deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the caring, the strengths and resilience of Aboriginal women in Aboriginal communities, particularly considering the topic that we're looking at today. Can I also thank the leadership team at BCEC, who have been fantastic champions of understanding, analysing, giving us the data to really have good insights so that we can start to unpick the knots that are gender inequity in our community So thank you to Alan and Rebecca in particular, who have brought expertise and dedication to that task, and to Libby Lyons, a tireless champion for gender equity, and you'll be missed in the sector. I hope you're not going too far. I know we'll see you more in Western Australia, and we'll be the better for it. So thank you very much. And can also acknowledge Graham Kerr, who's here from South 32, who's a significant employer in Western Australia, an employer who is walking the talk when it comes to gender equality, making real change and commitment to this topic. And finally, my Directors General. I've got a couple of them here, including my own in Department of Communities. So this is such an important issue and one that's dear to my heart. Many of you would have heard me speak before, but I talk about getting a fire in my belly when I was in high school, girls. For those of you who are here, I started to understand this issue and be what I described as cranky about it. And 40 years later, I'm still cranky because it's taking far too long to address these gender inequities, and you're starting to see that impatience writ large on the national scale here and the national stage, and at a large scale in Australia. I think for anyone who understands this issue knows that it will not be a single issue that will resolve this. But we need to take these opportunities when they come before us. We need to continue being impatient about change. We have a right to be impatient and demand change. But we need to keep our foot on the pedal, because it's not just one thing that's going to resolve this. It requires a multifaceted approach. And the analysis that we've seen with BCEC's work and the work of WGEA is crucial to really deeply understanding, as I said before, the extent of this problem if we hope to resolve it. We have seen huge improvements in many areas of life, and we can't forget that. Things are improving compared to where we've come from, but we know there is a way to go. And if we needed any reminder of that, we know that since 2008, Australia has slipped down on the global gender equality ladder from 15th place in 2008 to 44th currently. So we need to remember that this will take dedicated work and concerted action over time. In Western Australia, we know that shamefully we have a couple of indicators that say that we have a way to go, and that is particularly in the gender pay gap for salaries, and that is we're currently at 22.9, just under 23%, compared to the national average of 13.5% or 13.4%. So Western Australia has been consistently higher in our gender pay gaps than the other states, and I find particularly motivating that other states, I think Victoria and South Australia, at about 9%. So it is possible to get those gender pay gaps down, and we've got to do that work in Western Australia. Last year, on International Women's Day, I launched the Stronger Together WA's plan for gender equality to drive gender equality and create lasting change in our state. It's important to benefit our community. One of the key actions the government committed to as part of that plan is the development of a stronger procurement process for state government. We're a major purchaser of services, of goods and services in Western Australia, and we need to use that leverage power. We're committed to do more work on that. The Department of Communities will do that work with the Department of Finance. The Department of Communities will also be the first in Australia to trial a voluntary public sector reporting to WGEA. And this is something that I think is a no-brainer, that you make sure that governments are reporting to WGEA and working in that same data set. But to that end, the state government made sure that it was using BCEC to do our own analysis. We have a 3-year report card on how we're going on gender equity across the state. And for the first time under our government, we commissioned the BCEC to do that work, so we can start to line up those skill sets, those data sets. The McGowan government also set a target of 50% women in the senior executive service. And I'm very pleased to say that as of September last year, women now make up 42.4% of the SES, short of 50%, but a huge improvement on 34% when we came to office. And it shows what a difference that a concerted effort can make. Similarly, for a target that we set for government boards and committees, we said that when we came to the last election that we would have 50% women on boards and committees. And I'm very pleased to say that we met and exceeded that target in the first 4 years of government. What's particularly exciting, though, after the state election is the number of women in Parliament. We now have, as many of you would know, on the centenary of the first woman being elected to an Australian Parliament, Edith Cowan, we not only have reached now 100 women being elected into the Parliament, it's pretty, I think, and again, very shameful that it's taken us 100 years to get there, but we have now met and exceeded 100 women being elected into the Parliament over time. But in fact, in the Legislative Assembly alone, women of the Labor Party that I represent, women represent 47.5% of our MPs. Very proud of that. The Parliament as a whole is on track to have 45% representation as a result. Partly of, I have to say, Labor's heavy lifting on that. We've had an affirmative action policy since 1993, and that has resulted in a big, and our success in the last election has resulted in now women being comprising 45% of the total Parliament. Now that's an improvement from 31% of the total Parliament. So it has taken us a long time to move forward. In fact, for many years we were stuck at a third of the Parliament, and we're now moving up to 45%. So I think we should be very pleased with that progress. It's a debate that the Liberal Party, for instance, is having about how it starts to improve the number of women amongst its own ranks. And if you needed any reminder of that, Labor now has more women in the Legislative Assembly representing it and in Labor than the Liberal Party has ever had elected to the state parliament in its history. So you can see that without concerted effort and change, and if necessary, putting structures in place, hard targets, quotas, affirmative action, call it what you will, you will really find it difficult to change practice. And my message very clearly is not only that that's something that I'm proud of being part of a party that tackled that issue some decades ago, but I think it'll look different in different industries. We see that the resources sector is starting to make real change, and they are really doing some of the hard yards in understanding gender inequality amongst their ranks and trying to address it. And there's a lot of work for them to do. But similarly, what this will look like, what the solutions will look like in different industries need to be approached within those industries, and will require leadership from those industries if they hope to address it. Just finally, I just wanted to make some comments about what's happening in the federal arena. People are acutely aware of the ongoing safety issues for women, both at home and in the workplace. I know that as the First Minister for the Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. We know in Western Australia we have high levels of domestic violence, and we've got to do something about that. But we have seen this play out very recently in the media in recent weeks. It's vital that we create systems to make sure that victims and workplaces have clear responses and processes through which people can make complaints and raise concerns. And the best practice for this is clearly outlined in the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian workplaces. It's called Respect at Work report. And I urge the federal government to look at all of those recommendations very closely and can consider those and commit itself publicly to the adoption of those recommendations. It's vital that we not only address the specifics in each industry to address gender inequality, but that the whole community, including our young people, see leadership about this at government, at corporate, at community levels. And I, for one, am very proud to be part of a government that is committed to gender equality and do all that we can in the next 4 years to put our shoulder to the wheel to make sure that we improve the data, but more importantly, we improve the life outcomes for girls and women in our community. So I look forward to the panel discussion, and again, thank Curtin University, Bankwest and WGEA for their work in giving us the data that we're talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. Some interesting statistics that you've pointed out there, and I'm very interested to hear more from you through the panel this morning. We'll take a very, very, very short break. Breakfast will be served and we'll be back shortly. Thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, breakfast is being served, as you can see, but feel free to continue having your breakfast as well. As I welcome Professor Alan Duncan and Associate Professor Rebecca Cassells from the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre.
Thanks, Tracy, and thank you all for joining us for this morning's launch. We very much appreciate your interest in an issue that is perhaps more relevant now than ever: how we make gender equality a priority for Australia. So Beck and I will share in the presentation of the main findings from this report, but before I do, we'd also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on this morning, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this series benefits from an ongoing partnership between the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And we'd like to thank the great people from WGEA who've given us such support in building this research programme. So this collection captures nearly 4.4 million workers. That's around 1/3 of the total Australian workforce, from more than 11,000 companies with at least 100 employees. There have now been 7 years of reporting data, which has led to the data maturing into an incredibly powerful and critically longitudinal source of information. In past years, we've released a series of reports looking at closing the gender pay gap, progressing women in leadership, and delivering better business outcomes. And for this year's report, we've turned our focus to how and why organisations should make gender equity a priority. So we take a close look at Australia's top performers in good gender practice, those that have consistently taken steps to improve gender equality outcomes over the last 7 years. We look at the progress that's been made in Australia to narrow the gender pay gap, but we also reflect on how far we still have to go to achieve parity. We ask why some companies do better than others in making, and importantly, keeping gender equality a priority, and what factors are most likely to drive success. And we also release findings from a new Gender Equality Good Practice Index that shows how regular and comprehensive gender equality processes can work in driving down pay gaps and driving up the representation of women on boards. So now over to Beck to look at what we've achieved, but also how far we have left to go.
Thanks, Alan. So the gender pay gap has been with us for some time, a long time, across the breadth and the depth of our labour markets. But before I get into how this has changed over time, I want to remind you all of what the gender pay gap is and why it's important. So it's the difference between the wages women and men can access in the labour market, and it tells us about that overall inequality across the labour market. It's not a synonym for pay equity, but pay equity is a driver of the gender pay gap. It can also tell us about the value of women's work and occupations and industries that they concentrate in, their access to more senior and higher paid roles, and it tells us about the current and future economic security that women will have. We have been making progress over time. The full-time total remuneration, taking into account bonuses and additional pay, gender pay gap has fallen from 24.7 to 20.1% over the last 7 years of the WGEA reporting data. So this is a drop of 4.6 percentage points. We've been making even faster progress in the managerial ranks, with the pay gap narrowing by between 5 and 7 percentage points over this same time period. But for non-managers, the change has been a lot slower, non-existent, or even increased over that time period. And while the current rate of change is positive overall, if we keep to this pace, it's still going to be around a quarter of a century to eliminate the pay gap. For executives, the gender pay gap may disappear a little faster, but it's less positive for community and personal service workers, sales workers, and technicians and trades. If the average annual rate of change continues, the gender pay gap for full-time executives would be eliminated within the next 10 years. And for senior managers, in less than 15 years. But for non-manager occupations, this will take longer, with some occupations unlikely to see any change at all in the gender pay gap if the current trends continue. A quarter of a century to close the gender pay gap for full-time workers is a long time, but we can get there faster if we start paying closer attention to how women and men are paid. One of the most effective ways to narrow the gender pay gap is by undertaking a comprehensive pay audit, and this needs to happen every single year. Companies that stop pay audits quickly go backwards, as we can see in this chart. In fact, these companies stopped their pay audit in 2017, and they saw the managerial pay gap grow by 5.1 percentage points. This compares to a decrease of 2 percentage points for companies that undertook a pay gap audit every year. The impact of pay audits on the non-managerial workforce is not as strong, but the relationship is still there. Organisations that stopped pay audits went backwards, and organisations that continued pay audits every year made some progress. But we are seeing considerable variation across industries when we look at those that actually take up pay gap audits. And while they have become more common practice, more than 50% of organisations reporting to WGEA every year still are not undertaking a pay gap audit. And as organisations operating in the education and training and healthcare and social assistance sectors that are the least likely to undertake a pay gap audit. And this is the purple bars in this chart. Organisations operating in public administration and safety, and this is non-government because government does not currently report to WGEA, finance and insurance, professional services and the mining sector consistently undertake pay gap audits, and this is the blue bars in this same chart. If we want to see change, we will need to see consistency across all sectors. Alan.
Thanks, Beck. So research from earlier reports in this series show us that more women on boards leads to narrower gender pay gaps and more women in senior leadership positions. But increasing the share of women on boards doesn't just lead to better outcomes for gender equality, it also leads to better behavioural and business outcomes too. Companies with more women on boards are less likely to be involved in fraud and more likely to be socially responsive. And last year's Gender Equity Report showed definitively that more women on boards is causally linked to better company performance, profitability, and productivity. Women's representation on company boards has certainly improved in Australia. According to the latest WGEA data, just over 28% of board positions are now held by women. This represents an increase of 4.5 percentage points over the last 7 years. The share of women who hold board chair positions has also improved over time, but it's still much rarer for the chair of the board to be a woman. Currently, 14.6% of company board chairs are female. But these shares also vary a great deal by industry sector, both in percentage terms, but also relative to the share of women overall who work in that sector. We tend to see a higher share of women on boards in more female-dominated industries. For example, women hold 39% of board positions in the healthcare and social assistance sector, with 80% of the healthcare service workforce comprised of women. Shares are lower for industries that are traditionally male-dominated, but these industries also tend to have shown greater improvements. In mining companies, for example, the share of women on boards has doubled to 20% over the last 7 years, while 18% of workers in mining are women. In fact, mining is the only sector where female board membership exceeds the overall share of women in the workforce. Agriculture, wholesale trade, finance, insurance, healthcare and social assistance all have half as many female board members compared to the share of women overall. Now, given many known benefits from greater diversity on governing boards, there's a compelling case to target equal representation of women and men, whatever the overall gender balance of employees within an organisation or across the industry. Some organisations that report to WGEA each year have set internal targets for greater diversity on their governing bodies, but this has generally been on the decline. In 2015, 16.1% of organisations that reported to WGEA had set a specific target for the share of women on governing boards. This fell to 12.7% in 2016 and has pretty much flatlined at around 8% since then. Now, this may be because targets have been met, or it may be because ambitions are starting to wane. But we are more likely to see change, and change at a faster pace if targets are met. This chart shows the link between setting targets to increase women's representation on boards and the share of women on boards that eventuates. Companies that set targets consistently over the last 6 years increased female board membership by 7.3 percentage points to 31.1% between 2015 and 2020. That's twice the pace of those that set no targets in the last 6 years. So targets clearly work, but are they ambitious enough? The Australian Institute of Company Directors recommends a ratio of 40% male, 40% female, and 20% other to be a good practice model, with 30% as the minimum target for women on boards. But we're a long way from achieving a 40-40-20 goal. Two substantial barriers are likely to be constraining this recommendation. The first is a lack of specific targets being set, and the second is that where targets are set, ambition is lacking. There's a demonstrable level of apathy amongst Australia's biggest organisation when it comes to increasing the number of women on boards. But for whatever the reason, we'd argue very strongly for organisations to renew their commitment to raising the share of women on boards, and not just to improve gender equality outcomes, but also to drive better company outcomes. Beck.
Thanks, Oz. So why are some companies better than others in delivering improved gender equity outcomes to their workers? Better at narrowing their gender pay gap and getting more women in leadership? What factors drive this success, and what can we learn about good practice by looking at companies that have consistently taken steps to improve gender equality over time? Well, to answer these questions, we do what we normally do, and we look at the data and we construct an index. So a new index combining 22 indicators of good gender equality practice, and we assess how consistently reporting organisations have applied these over the last 7 years. So these indicators fit within the broad domains of pay gap strategies, analysis and reporting, recruitment, retention, reporting and training, workplace gender equality supports and actions like flexible work policy and parental leave. Organisations receive an overall score and are ranked from most comprehensive and consistent to least comprehensive and consistent. If an organisation implemented all policies in every single year, they would get a score of 100, and 0 if they implemented no policy or action in any year whatsoever. And this is what the average scores look like across industry sectors and how they have changed between 2015 and 2020. So finance and insurance are most likely to follow the best gender equality practices on this measure, with an average score rising from 57.5 in 2015 to 61.6 in 2020. This sector has also had the largest or the highest gender pay gap, but over time it has fallen by 10 percentage points over the last 7 years. So that's at over double the rate of what we're seeing across the whole workforce. Mining companies ranked third in 2020 with an index score increasing pretty substantially by 8.4 points. Construction companies ranked the lowest of all sectors, but they've also seen the biggest improvement over time. Organisations in education and training, healthcare and social assistance and agriculture rank the lowest on average terms in their approach to consistent and comprehensive gender equality practices, and have also shown the least improvement over time. So in fact, businesses in finance and insurance are 2.9 times more likely to be following best gender equality practice compared to the industry average. In the utilities sector, 2.8 times more likely, and in the mining sector, 2.4 times more likely. Organisations in education, training and agriculture are only half as likely to be following good practice. And in the healthcare sector, they're only a quarter as likely to be following good practice than the industry average. So what type of links can we see between consistent good practice and outcomes? And this chart shows the good practice index on the horizontal and the change in the gender pay gap on the vertical across industry sectors. The bigger the circle, the larger the share of women. And we can see a strong positive correlation between a higher score on the good practice index and the gender pay gap. The higher the score, the more likely the gender pay gap has decreased over time. The lower the score, the more likely it has remained relatively flat. I'll now hand to Alan for some more insights into why some businesses are falling behind more than others. Alan.
Thanks, Beck. Now, I expect you to memorise all numbers on this table before the next slide. I know I don't really. So this is a visualisation of the average consistency with which companies in each industry sector implement each of the gender equality policies and practices in the list that Beck went through just now. As before, a score of 100 indicates that every company in the sector implements the policy measure in each year, the darkest blue cells here, while a score of 0 indicates that no companies apply the policy or strategy in any year. That's the deepest maroon. And light colours are in the middle of that range. So what's really interesting in this table is that with few exceptions, companies across most sectors fall well short when it comes to setting specific targets for pay equity and setting objectives to narrow the pay gap. We also find there to be far less accountability for driving change through reporting to the company executive and board. And relatively few companies set specific targets for women's representation on boards. But suppose companies committed to broaden the range of policies they implement to drive change and do so regularly. Well, consistency works. The top 10% of companies with the most consistent and comprehensive gender equity policies saw gender pay gaps fall between 2015 and 2020 by 4.4 percentage points for managers and 2.3 percentage points for non-managers. Those companies that were the least consistent saw gender pay gaps fall by only 1.4 percentage points for managers over the same period, with no change at all in the pay gap for non-managers. And consistency also works in growing the share of female top-tier managers and board members. Companies that implement regular and comprehensive pay equality policies saw the share of female key management personnel increase by 10.2 percentage points over time, and the share of female managers by 5.5 percentage points. And in contrast, companies with the least commitment increased the share of top-tier managers by only 1.6 percentage points, and female managers by 2.1 percentage points. And for board membership, again, you can see the relationship between a consistent commitment to gender equality and improved numbers when it comes to representation on boards. So now over to Beck to close with some insights for best policy and practice. Beck.
When the WGEA reporting requirement was introduced in 2012, there was an expectation that this would lead to real positive change in promoting and improving gender equality outcomes within Australian workplaces. Organisations would be more likely to pay closer attention to how they recruit, promote and reward men and women, more likely to introduce policies and practices to support balancing work and family, and more likely to address different aspects of respect, agency and safety at work and at home. Together, these actions would lead to greater gender equality in our workplaces. And since reporting began in 2014, we have seen this positive change. Reporting organisations are now far more likely to have comprehensive gender equality policies than at the start of the reporting regime. Flexible workplace supports and, for carers, such as paid parental leave. They are also more likely to be closely examining their gender pay gap and have put in place formal policies to support employees experiencing domestic violence. Through our Good Practice Index, we find that consistent application and attention to a suite of workplace policies and actions will deliver gender equality outcomes, translating to lower pay gaps and more women in senior leadership positions. But despite these changes, these positive changes, we have now come to a point where the pace of change has slowed and many are taking their eye off the gender equality ball. Ambition wanes in efforts to increase the number of women on boards, to narrow the gender pay gap through regular pay audits, and in the implementation of policies and practices that help make workplaces more gender equitable. So how do we move, or how do we make gender equality a priority? How do we move to a point where more organisations are prioritising gender equality and making this a permanent and regular occurrence rather than something that is focused on every other year? Well, we see three elements that are needed. The first is leadership. Leadership that is committed to gender equality will play one of the most significant roles in creating and sustaining more gender equitable workplaces. We know that when leaders care about an issue, a process, an outcome, the rest of the organisation cares too. Leaders direct what needs to be paid attention to and implicitly or explicitly invoke a level of accountability to make it stick. And of course, diversity in leadership ranks will help this along even further. Organisations need to be more ambitious in their efforts to improve gender equality. Our findings show that where an objective does exist, it's likely to be met. We can see this very clearly when organisations have set targets for women on boards. Board targets work, but they're also lacking ambition. A target of 30% has been set and it's been reached for many organisations. This tells us that targets are possible, but without them, they are unlikely to progress. And without more ambitious targets, we are unlikely to move very much further along beyond that 30% self-imposed floor that we've set for ourselves. And last but not least, embedding practices and processes will make a difference and withstand leadership changes and focus. And regular pay gap audits. These are one of the most significant actions organisations can take in narrowing the gender pay gap. Embedding these and other practices into an organisation's annual performance metrics will help ensure that consistent attention is paid to how women and men are rewarded and positioned within an organisation. Pay audits, along with a suite of other strategies and actions, should be a regular practice that all organisations take up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and to Alan for presenting that report. Of course, we'll have them back very shortly for the panel to hear further reaction to this report as well. I'd like now to welcome Libby Lyons, Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, to the stage to deliver her remarks for this year's findings.
Thank you, Tracy. And I too would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation today. And may I say, Sandra, what a beautiful, beautiful welcome to country from a beautiful soul. So thank you. I feel terribly safe. And I would too like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The agency is situated in the beautiful city of Sydney, and I really would like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land on which we work, and we are very privileged to work in that beautiful city of Sydney, but I have to say I'm far more privileged to live here in Perth, of course. May I also welcome the Minister and thank you so much for your commitment. The work you are doing here in Western Australia is phenomenal, and I go around and I see a lot of work that is happening in a lot of states, and I would have to say it generally comes down to one or two people in government who are committed and who actually practice what they preach, and you certainly do here, Minister. Thank you for all your efforts, and we will get there in Western Australia. We all need to put in a bit of effort, but we will get there if we keep our eye on the ball. 6 years we've been in partnership with Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and over that 6 years they have taken our data, analysed it and produced 6 amazing reports, reports that have provided hard evidence for the business case, for the economic case for gender equality. I don't know how many more times I can talk to people in business and government to explain that the economics case, the business case for gender equality is very clear. The evidence is there. We see it day in, day out, and we've seen it 6 years in a row with the beautiful work that's been done by Alan and Beck and their team. And yet it's still ignored. We still have organisations all over Australia who just think it's a ticker box exercise when they report into us every year. And that's clearly becoming evidenced in the stalling of the data that we see and have seen in the last 2 years. How many more ways do I need to explain it? If you are a business person, if you are accountable for the business that you are running and keeping it profitable and growing it, if you're on a board or you're on an executive team and you are ignoring the data, you are ignoring the hard evidence, then you are not, in my mind, meeting your fiduciary duty to your shareholders and your owners. And you are not being fair and just to the people who are working for you, who diligently come into that office or work from home every day. I can't make it any clearer than that. And in my last 4 weeks of heading up the agency, I would have to say that I will keep pushing that message, and I will keep using the evidence and the data that's been produced by Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre. But I would also say that the data set we have in the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's data set, it is a national treasure. It is census data that we collect every year. We are the only country in the world with a longitudinal data set that presents us with a true picture of what is happening in Australian workplaces today, yesterday, and for the years gone by. So because it is a national treasure, we must ensure that we review it, and it's time for the legislation to be reviewed, because we need to update the information that we collect to ensure that we remain relevant with the changing labour market. But most importantly, we must protect this data set. And I still, as I wander around, hear people talk about what a waste of money the agency is, and that the collection of data is a waste of organisations and private enterprises' time. It's not. It is so important. Data drives the way we do things. Data should be driving our public policy. So we must protect this data set at all costs. And I think that in seeing the people that are here today and the leaders that are in this room today, I know we have great advocates in you. And please keep reporting. Keep doing what you're doing, but keep your foot on the pedal, because it is the only way we are going to see real change in this country, change we so desperately need, where we are all treated equally, fairly, justly, where we all have equal choice, and hopefully where we are all treated with pure old respect and kindness. Thank you.
Libby, thank you so much for that impassioned chat there, and I totally agree with you of what you said at the end there. Kindness, it's always so key, and respect as well. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to now welcome our other panellists to the stage. It's going to be a great bit of a chat here. Just a warning as well, we are running a bit behind time, but look, we won't keep you too much longer. I know it's a Friday afternoon, so hopefully, we've got a more relaxed vibe for you before you have to head off to work. I'd like to welcome now to the stage Graham Kerr, Chief Executive Officer, South 32 and Chair of CEOs for Gender Equity. Obviously, Minister Simone McGurk, MLA, will be back on the stage. And our panel obviously has been pondering these findings as well. So I'll have a seat too, and then we'll get this panel chat started. And don't forget your questions on Slido as well, ladies and gentlemen, because we'll present that to them as well. I think everyone's got their seats. Oh, the system works. I went from the lectern to here, so thank you to the AV guys. It's all smooth. Graham, welcome to you. I'd like to go to you first, if that's all right. When it comes to gender equity practices, the mining sector has been the biggest improver, as we've just seen on the report there through Alan and Rebecca. Can you share some of the learnings from South 32?
Yeah, look, absolutely can. And I think the comment around improver is the important point. There's still a long way to go. If you look across the industry, I think there's some great examples of what people are doing. But if I focus on South 32, if we look at our numbers, and we sort of come out of a system where we have a large business in South Africa, as they came out of apartheid, we were very much into quotas and targets. And to be honest, quotas and targets drive outcomes. So I think, we're a big supporter of that. We've had in place targets around board, my leadership team, our senior leadership team, our operational team, and our broader workforce from day one. And we're not quite where we want to be, but on some of those statistics we have improved. Look, we have a female chair, Karen Wood, who's sitting in the audience here. We have about 38% of our board is female. If you look at my direct reports, it's about 50-50. Female, male. If we go down to the next level at the end of last year, our senior leadership team was about 36% female. But as we get into the operational side of the business, it becomes more challenging, where we have about 18%. If we get into our total workforce, it's only about 19%. The reality is that's a sign of how far we've got to go, because in that space there, our workforce should represent a background demographic wherever we operate if we want to access that talent pool. And we're not there yet in Australia in that space. We've put a number of things in place, like quotas and targets. We have things in place like a family care policy. We structure our workforce around providing flexibility where we actually can, if it's particularly not a fly-in, fly-out operation. Where we have gaps, I guess, at the moment are probably on a couple of fronts. We're not bringing in enough talent, technical talent into the business, and we're losing proportionally more females than we are males. So that's areas we've got to work on. We certainly, if you like, during COVID, if you think about our business, we operate in some of the hotspots around COVID: Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, Mozambique. So, that sort of was a focus for us for the last 12 months. But as we get into our new financial year, sort of plugging those gaps, making those big steps forward are a big driver for us. But absolutely believe in targets and having the right framework policy, and sort of maybe putting on a broader hat. Tanya, who's sitting at our table there, is, we both belong to the CEOs of Gender Equity in WA, and the data shows that, our members who we've been pushing into this space for a period of time, they do proportionally better on average than other people in the state. But even in Western Australia, we have a huge pay gap that is still left, and only 1 in 2 companies actually do an annual pay audit. That just tells you how far we've all got to go.
Absolutely. It's chipping away though, isn't it? Slowly but surely.
Well, to Libby's point, it's going too slow.
Yeah. All right, well, hopefully we can ramp things up from this report. Minister, we're talking about, I want to move on to about WGEA, and we know that governments don't have to necessarily report to WGEA. Do you think that's fair in terms of, given that they are some of the biggest employers?
Yeah, so I was first made Minister for Women's Interests in 2017, and it's always seemed to me a bit nonsensical that we didn't report. It was just a matter of the legislation, the federal legislation, but it makes sense for state governments, who are the biggest employer in each state, to then add to that data set. So as Libby was saying, it's a fantastic data set, but we're missing a big piece of the picture, partly with small business, but that's another challenge, but with state and federal governments as well not reporting. So I've raised it with, I think, 3 ministers, federal ministers now, but I am pleased that we're going to have a trial, as I mentioned in my speech, that we will do some voluntary reporting.
A trial initially, and then how long?
Yeah, that's right. So we'll continue those discussions with WGEA and the federal government, because I think it makes sense that we report. And it makes sense from, I noticed one of the questions on Slider is, should the state government be doing mandatory pay audits? I would prefer, if we're doing that, to do it in concert with the WGEA data set, because then we can just fit in neatly to that work and we're not replicating the systems.
Yep. Yeah, of course, yes.
So I think the thing is that governments have never been mandated to report in because of that, there are all sorts of legislation issues there. But we are implementing a new system that we have developed for this reporting period, and part of the development of that has been to allow for voluntary reporting from state, federal and local governments. It's great that, and the Minister has been fantastic in pushing that WA be part of that initial run. So we will be doing that initial run in the middle of the year with a view to ramping that up to once we make sure that we've got all the data matches correct, and it's no mean feat, trust me. But the minute we've ramped that up and can collect data from the public sector, the Minister can then say, right, the whole of the WA government have to start reporting in, and we can produce reports and do all of those sorts of things. Once we have got all government reporting in, and this is the really important bit, we will cover 78% of all employees in Australia. That's why it's important that we get government reporting in.
And I guess it's transparency as well, isn't it? That's the key here that we're thinking about. I just want to quickly take one question from the floor from one of our students from Kent Street Senior High School. Anna Machado. I hope I pronounced that right, Anna. What's your question to the panel?
What are we missing out on by not maximising the talents of all genders?
Who wants to tackle that one first?
A lot.
Beck?
Yeah, a lot. I don't know if this is working ideas.
Yeah, there you go.
A lot. We're missing out on a lot. We're missing out on half the ideas, half the lived experiences, half the brain power, half the talent. We're missing out on an awful lot. So, a lot.
Simone or
Yeah, obviously there's the central question of people's right to reach their full potential. You know, why should only one gender have access to, you know, certain jobs, certain industries, progression? But as Rebecca said, it's really the smart thing to do as well from an economic point of view on the state. If we want to be competitive, we've got to access the full talent pool there. And also, I think if you look at it from a male point of view as well, they've been missing out on some of the other side of life in a way. So I think everyone benefits from change, and that's a message that you know, I'm happy to talk about and to champion wherever I can.
It's interesting, I think, as well, like we can learn from each other. It's not just, you know, I guess in male-dominated industries, they're missing out on what we can provide as females to that particular industry. Graham, I mean, do you have anything to add?
Oh, look, the only thing I'd add is, I mean, to me, there's a whole piece around, for starters, common decency, that everyone should have the same entitlement to the same opportunities. But it's the bigger picture around, there's been so many studies, Alan mentioned them as well, around, you know, the more diverse teams you have, the better outcomes you have. And as a company that's probably struggling to find talent in some areas, why would I not want to access the whole talent pool?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about a particular industry here. This is a question from Slido by Chris in the room, so thank you, Chris. Why is it that the care industries, health and social services with a female-dominated workforce are the least likely to follow best practice?
It seems quite paradoxical, given the fact that the health care and social assistance sector is so heavily female-dominated. But there's a sense in which precisely that fact may lend itself to a degree of complacency. We're, you know, so well represented by women within our workforce across the piece. We don't need to try as hard, potentially. Of course, that's not something that we have, you know, direct knowledge of, but we can simply interrogate the data and identify the fact that not just in healthcare and social assistance, but actually in other female-dominated industry sectors, there seems to be less drive and less, continued push towards greater gender equality outcomes. Now, of course, the male-dominated sectors maybe had further to travel, but you can see that progress has been much stronger and more consistent amongst that subset of industry sectors. So perhaps the very fact that the female-dominated industries are so heavily represented by women is in itself something that really flags an issue with the leadership in those sectors being complacent or as we said, taking their eye off the ball.
I think too, one of the problems is that I think the female-dominated sectors think, oh, well, we got women, we haven't got a problem. But the problem's in reverse. Mm-hmm. And what we need is balance. We need balance everywhere we go, and we need our workplaces, our board tables, executive rooms. We need them all to represent the communities in which we live.
Sounds pretty simple, Libby, doesn't it? All right. The education sector, this one from Donna, poor performance against gender equality metrics. What impact does the high rate of job casualisation have on this outcome?
Can I just make a point about that casualisation?
Yes.
For instance, I think there's been a bit of discussion about that following COVID, that if we're not careful, what will happen as we move out of the pandemic, that we will cement some of those inequalities instead of taking the opportunity to move forward. And precarious employment generally, casual, temporary, fixed-term contracts are a real challenge and disproportionately impact women. But the point I'd make about the education sector, whether it's high schools or primary schools and tertiary, is that the solutions do have to be driven within the sector, within that particular industry, if they're going to work. But ultimately, and I think it was a slide that I took a photo of, the summary, is that it requires leadership. It requires the leadership in that sector, but also individual institutions to say, yes, we're going to take this seriously and we're going to do what we can to drive change.
I think also, this sector, education and training, particularly the university sector, has been one of the most heavily impacted by COVID, by the international border closures. And it's also been one of the sectors that hasn't been supported by federal government policies, really, and other government policies. So it is actually in a position at the moment where we are seeing, I think the latest figure was 17,000 people that have been laid off in the higher education sector. So this is a significant number of really highly skilled workers that no longer have jobs. The casualisation is going to be a response to that, because there is a level of uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, you are going to get casualisation. You are going to get insecure jobs, and you're going to get precarious work, and there's a Senate inquiry into that right at this very moment. In terms of the way in which that's going to affect the data, well, I would say the education and training sector does have the highest rates of paid parental leave in addition to what is offered by government at the base rate. So it's doing really well on that particular indicator, probably better than most of the other sectors, but it does fall short in other ways, and I think this casualisation probably means that a lot of this is going to be hidden in the sector, so we have to look out for that.
Jobs, a whole nother breakfast, I think. A whole other discussion to have. This one had quite a few votes on Slido, so thank you everyone. From Shelley, what are the findings for Indigenous women? Is there any visibility?
No. Bottom line, no. And I would love to see, and that's why, as I say, it's time to review the Act. We've been collecting the data for 7 years now. We need to look at the things that we're missing, such as age, but we're going to be asking about that this year, ethnicity, where people work, the postcode of where people work, because at the moment the data we get from Bunnings says everybody works in Perth. And of course that's not true. So there's so much more we could be gathering very easily too. And information around Indigenous women, where they're working, the age group, and whether they're managers and non-managers, all of that information is so important. So we need to review the Act.
Why is 30% the apathy goal for women on boards? What's magic about 30%? What's that all about?
For me? Okay. Look, I think 30% started as a movement in the UK, and I think it's probably become a minimum standard. I mean, my argument would be, why not 50-50? Again, similar to the comments that I made earlier, it's all about every part of your workforce should represent your background demographic. I think that's the key.
Absolutely. This one is very, very current at the moment, public debate about workplace culture. How can that culture be measured? I think there's been a lot of talk as well, particularly this week, about language being used and reactions for particular issues. I'm sure you would have heard everything in the news, especially out of Canberra. So what's your take on this one?
Can I say, I think, first of all, having a more diverse presence in the workplace is a good start. So in any of these workplaces, it starts to shake things up. So male or any domination, as Libby was saying, really, of one of the genders, one gender over the other, one sex over the other, will cause distortions. But in the case of male-dominated industries or workplaces, that creates a problem. So diversity in the workplace will make a difference. Making sure that, again, at a leadership level, people take this issue seriously and have not only clear guidelines and complaints processes, but that everyone is aware of what those guidelines and complaints processes are. And I make the point again that I think that will look different in different industries or different workplaces. So in the Parliament, for instance, I'm not in Canberra, but you've got this strange relationship between kind of the formal public sector and then the elected members, etc., and the political processes and considerations. So they need to be taken into account if you want those processes to be effective. But finally, I think that the leadership and the determination to take this seriously is also crucial. I mean, really, this is not only common decency, which we've heard referred to a few times, but it's the expectation that people will act professionally. And all of those are necessary. But can I just make one final point, and that is about, in my role as understanding the extent and combating domestic violence. It's taking the time and continuing to look at how this manifests, what this actually looks like, and what are the dynamics. And I don't think we can expect it'll be one simple thing. We've got to keep going and be prepared to talk about it and change if we want to change our ways.
Yeah, indeed. Libby, this one's probably for you. What's the next step for WGEA reporting? Will it expand or diversify its data?
Well, again, it comes back to a review of the legislation. But in the meantime, we, in developing our new system, have done a lot of work around the business rules that we apply to the data set. And this year, organisations will be asked for new data points on a voluntary basis, but I would heartily ask you all to do it anyway. We will be asking for things like age, so the age, the date of birth of your employee, all this information, of course, is de-identified, and postcodes. There is a lot that we need to do. But I know too that we are also asking you for some information that we can't use because the data is not sound. And the integrity of it is not strong enough for us to be able to use it. So that's a nonsense as well. So we need to review this legislation so we don't have to ask you those questions. So it's really just important to know that, okay, we're at this point now to move to that next step, to get this better data, to get the more comprehensive picture. We need to have a thorough and comprehensive review.
Indeed. This one from Janet. Are unionised workplaces more likely to achieve higher levels of gender equity, or are there no correlations?
We, again, within the WGEA data set, it's hard to create that direct connection, and so we're limited in that regard. We can only draw inference just from background knowledge of the level of unionisation across industry sectors. So we wouldn't be able to comment too strongly on that within the context of these data. Okay.
All right. Would the public... I'm just trying to work my way around through all these questions on Slido. Will the state public sector, the state's largest employer, be introducing mandatory gender pay equity audits? Right for you, Minister.
So I think I addressed that earlier when I said that it makes sense to see if we can fit in with the WGEA reporting. So we've done a lot in our first term. I talked about boards and committees, senior women to SES positions, a massive increase. I'm really pleased to say that we now have our Public Sector Commissioner, some key central agencies. We have heads in Western Australia, the Department of Finance, the acting head of Premier and Cabinet. So we're starting to see some changes there, but definitely I think a closer examination of what's happening agency by agency and starting to pull out some of that work is necessary for us. And I've been speaking to the Public Sector Commissioner, Sharon O'Neill, about doing that. But if we were going to do mandatory reporting of gender pay gaps, or pay equity audit, I think it would make sense to try and do it and fit into the WGEA framework.
Kitty's question has a focus more on regional WA. Providing opportunities for remote and flexible working genuinely gives career opportunities for women. How do we support this in the regions?
That's a good question. I think I'd just comment quickly on an innovation that we've adopted in providing childcare in the regions. It's a big challenge for attracting and training families into smaller towns, but really necessary. And we've actually got this model in the wheat belt at the moment that's been quite successful, where there's a kind of lead community agency that we helped fund, and that holds all the accreditation. And then there's about 20 very small centres that sit underneath it. And so that means that they can meet all their regulatory compliances, which are quite rightly quite strict in childcare, but still be viable. And we just made an announcement that we'll look at extending that particular program out to some other regional areas. So I think making sure that we're trying to crack some of those practical issues for families is really important if we want to retain not only families in the regions, but utilise the talent that's there when people might go for blue-collar dominated work.
And certainly from an industry perspective, while COVID obviously has brought numerous challenges, it has also brought opportunities and fast-tracked some aspects. So if you look at some of our operations that are remote and they're fly in, fly out, it really tested who has to be on site. Do they have to be there all the time? Can they do their work remotely? So I think, that's a thing that we're seeing through things like Zoom, WebEx, Teams. There's a different way to collaborate in different work, and that does give us the opportunity to look at who has to be on site. Do they have to be there all the time? So I think that does open up not only for females, but also males who have families to sort of think about where they base themselves and how they come to work.
Yeah, indeed. This next one, how may the quotas and targets within organisations end up hurting women in senior roles by the misconception that they're in the role due to being a woman?
Can I answer that? Because I think if we flipped that and said, how may we end up, and it's just disappeared from the screen, but if we flipped that and said, well, how would it negatively impact on men in female-dominated industries? Would we say that? Would we say that men just got there because they were a man? I don't think we would. So it's an attitudinal thing here. It's attitudinal. We've got to change our attitudes.
A lot of people have been asking that, though. I hear it, and that's the narrative out there, on the streets, in workplaces as well. I mean, we're probably guilty of it in media as well.
So flip it.
Yeah.
Flip it and say, if the boot was on the other foot and we were looking at quotas or targets for men into female-dominated industries, would we question their merit? Would we speak negatively about them getting a senior executive role? No, we would not. Simple answer.
And I think the point here is that the data speaks. We've shown that greater diversity leads to better outcomes in businesses. That simply would not be the case if it was sort of tokenism in looking to change the gender balance on boards and in leadership.
I think it also needs to be accompanied by leadership at the workplace and industry level, saying this is what we expect, this is what we are adopting. If you don't like it, you don't, this is a clear commitment. And I must say, in a political party that's had quotas, essentially a very clear plan, that hasn't been dominant in our sector, but it has meant that there are people that come along, men and women, who say, why are we, does this mean that we're picking the right person? And, you know, we need to take the time to explain what's going on. And many of you would have heard before me say this, but in the early 90s when Labor adopted that affirmative action rule, there was a cartoon in the West that talked about merit. And, you know, we needed to just pick people on merit, and they said merit, and they had an asterisk, and it said men elevated regardless of intellect or talent. We do need to challenge that this is not a objective measure now. There are loadings that go on that we're trying to correct.
And that's what I think comes back to the point when I was talking about language as well, what's being used in the workplace, how what's the narrative that's being sort of spread across each workplace, each industry as well. So we've got to change that. And as you mentioned, it comes down from leadership and management. So we have to wrap it up there. I know we're running out of time, or we've passed the time. So thank you again to our panellists for tackling those questions, and thank you to everyone who put those questions through the Slido. So another round of applause for Beck, Alan, Graham, Minister and Libby. Thank you. I'd like now to invite Professor Chris Moran, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research and representing the Vice-Chancellor of Curtin University, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Tracy, and good morning, everybody. Not a person has hardly moved here with that panel. I think it could have gone on for another hour or so of listening. Sandra, thank you very much for your welcome this morning and the education that your people and your elders continue to give us as to why we should respect the culture and feel very lucky to be residents and to share the custodianship of the land with you. So thank you very much for having us speak and having us listen. I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Simone McGurk, MLA, Minister for Child Protection, Women's Issues, Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence and Community Services. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. And our distinguished guests, industry partners and collaborators in attendance today. We have a lot of leaders in the room today. On behalf of Curtin University, I'd like to congratulate the team for the report today and the presentation. This is the 6th in the series, a very important series, as we have said. I'd like to thank the staff of the Workplace Gender Equity Agency who have worked with Alan and Rebecca to bring this report and the Gender Equity Series to fruition. Curtin University prides itself on being involved in the issues of the day and the issues that matter and the things that impact society. And I think we can see from the report, from the background, the longitudinal data and the discussion, this is very high on the list. Although the message from the report is it's sliding, and it's sliding in a number of very important ways. Making it a priority should be a priority. On behalf of Curtin University, I'd like to thank Bankwest Managing Director, Ms. Sinead Taylor, and the executive leadership at Bankwest. This is an incredibly important partnership. It's the partnership between Curtin and Bankwest that bring this information, that bring this analysis, interpretation, discussion, and indeed, hopefully, a little bit of angst on this and some other issues. And as Libby Lyons has pointed out to us this morning, these data are gold. We are world leading in this area, and it's the partnership between Curtin and Bankwest that's sitting in the kernel there with WGEA to make sure every year we continue to look. Thank you again, Minister, for participating in today's launch and the panel discussion. Graham Kerr, CEO of South 32, Libby Lyons, Director of Workplace Gender Equality Agency, Associate Professor Rebecca Cassells, and John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan. Now, they've given me a little spot here to say a few things that have come up during the morning. And I risk stepping into the biggest mansplaining puddle that could possibly exist by attempting to summarise some of the issues. So I'd like to stick a little bit to the data. Minister, some of the data that you put forward as a testament to what's been done by the politicians in the state recently and over a long period of time. We have been on the other side. We share many boards and committees with the state government, and I can tell you the signal from the state government at change of government was clear. Give us female names, find females to sit on committees and boards. So it's fantastic to see that that's hit 50-50. One of the things I think that's really important is when we bring females to boards, and this has come up, how do we look for the merit that comes rather than define the merit that should arrive? And I think that's something that board chairs and other board participants and committee participants need to become far more active about. It's good to have independent research, isn't it? Particularly when your independent researchers come back and tell you're on the bottom of the list. Education and training appearing very far down that list is very sobering. My view is we look at these data in our university, perhaps we're not looking at them properly. Perhaps there's some very strong signals, not only for our sector, but also for our university in those data. So if you're from the industry and you're working with researchers across a range of areas and you get some data back that maybe don't fit your model or what you would have liked to have seen, take those data in and think about them and say, how might they help us rather than how might they threaten us? The business case is very clear in the data, but it gets ignored. How much clearer could I be? You couldn't be any clearer. So I want to step out of the mansplaining puddle and raise what I think sits in the middle that hasn't been touched on. We've had a polite morning again. And I'd raise this particularly from some comments of Karen Andrews this week. The leaders in Canberra that we've been focusing on are the wrong leaders. The leaders with wobbly voices and strange things to say and daily changing fundamental attitudes. Perhaps the leaders that we should be listening to in Canberra at the moment have the names of people like Penny Wong, Karen Andrews, Tanya Plibersek. These people are saying incredibly clear things. The data are getting worse. Tanya Plibersek this morning listing the names of the people she remembers. She would not stop crying if she kept thinking of all of the names. This sits underneath. The safety, the lack of safety sits underneath Karen Andrews. What's the problem of being a politician, a strong cabinet politician in Canberra? The males are making the decision, drinking with one another deep into the night in the Parliament House, where the females have decided they will not participate in that culture. It's male cultural problems. We've been polite about it this morning. It's laddism. It's the deal that's being done where people are excluded from the room. It's very important to have people around the table for governance. It's really important to have strong, meritorious selection processes. It's absolutely critical to have balanced decision processes. Who's in the room when the decisions are being made? Who's creating the spaces where people are excluded from those decisions? It's laddism. That sits at the heart of it. The lack of safety for the school children in the room looking at the future saying, you're telling me that I should be stepping up into a cultural domain where it's not safe to be. The statistics tell me it's not safe to be there. Males must speak to males. Stop seeing the female problem. Stop blaming the victims. The messages are really clear. The messages are really simple. We have to shift now to the conversation that says, so how do the males change? What do we do differently? How do we change the micro decisions, the thinking that we have? We still have to look at the big data sets. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we've got to get underneath this. This is why it sits. This is why it sits for decades. I don't know what my notes said. I'd also like to thank Rebecca Mitchell for your commentary this morning and for a stunning comment you made when we talked about the IT industry and that you'd become the first female CIO. And Rebecca's response was, I didn't think I was female. I didn't think I moved into something that was dominated. I didn't actually think I was the first. I was just getting the job that I interviewed for, was offered and accepted. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Tracy, for taking us over time. Making it a priority means we're putting something else aside. So thank you very much for working through the questions. Thank you all for coming today. Make gender equity a priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Moran. Thank you. Very impassioned speech there as well. This, of course, brings the event to a close. Very shortly, you'll receive a survey, a short survey in your email box. We encourage you to complete this survey to help the BCEC continually improve on their events. And thank you again to our speakers and panellists. Minister McGurk, thanks for your time this morning. I know you have a very busy schedule. And thank you everyone for attending today's report launch. But please also visit the BCEC website, bcec.edu.au for more information on other reports as well. But we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.